Yeah. Yep.
All right. It's on. How's that, Mason? Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom to everybody near and far. It's a Shehechianu moment once again that we had a community dinner, and we are having the Alan Worters lecture once again with a crowd in person. And is the first time ever, or maybe in a really long time, that we had a community dinner and came upstairs for the program instead of being downstairs. So let's just do a quick Shehechianu. We can't have enough of them, right? Thank you, God, that I'm alive. Let's just start with that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. And everybody on Zoom can say amen to us. So, good evening. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
The Alan Worters lecture, which this is number 17, honors the pursuit of Jewish learning at Hillel B'nai Torah with its mission of promoting adult education, which is accessible to all, by providing a multidimensional exploration of Jewish identity reflecting top-notch Jewish scholarship. And Rabbi Toba joins the ranks of Art Green and Leonard Fine and Lori Lefkowitz, many other greats who have had the honor of helping us remember Alan J. Worters. This fund was established by Paula Duress Worters, who I imagine and hope is watching. So the first thing I want us to do, everybody turn around and say, hello, Paula. And Mason, if Paula's not on, tell us and we'll do it again later. We'll do it for her. She's on, great. So Paula is watching from California. And, in the past, Paula has said something to open the lecture, but now that she is in her second year in California with her daughter, Hannah, I want to recognize this lecture not only in honor and memory of Alan, but also in honor of our connection to Paula and our gratitude to her for this lecture and for so much else in Hillel B'nai Torah and also in her life, in her work, in our bodies, ourselves. So many ways Paula has contributed. What makes this lecture unique is the spirit of Alan that was brought to it. Alan died in 2005. And he died just a year after the first adult B'nai Mitzvah group here at Hillel B'nai Torah, at least, probably ever, but at least in my time. Alan had a remarkable story. He was the child of a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, but he never knew anything about Judaism, his heritage. He only discovered one day, he's walking on the street with his mother, who ran into an old friend, and they started speaking in Yiddish. And Alan's jaw dropped. He didn't know his mother knew any other language besides English. And so it was after he met Paula, it was a second marriage for both of them, and his eyes were open to all kinds of things thanks to Paula. One was, Paula introduced him to political activism. Even though in the work he'd been doing, he was considered a bleeding heart liberal, he didn't really feel he had gone through the 60s as Paula had. And so she introduced him to that aspect of his life. And then when they came to Hillel B'nai Torah, which Paula had a connection to because of her Aunt Toby, Zichrona Livracha, Alan had another rebirth in learning about his Jewish heritage. And he immersed himself. He consumed everything in the Maya course. Anyone taking Maya knows that there's a whole list of books that nobody reads, except for Alan J. Worters, and explained them to people. So, and then when at that adult B'nai Mitzvah, it was Rosh Chodesh. I don't know what I was thinking, but it took like 3.5 hours to do this whole service with 10 adult B'nai Mitzvah. But I think for everybody, the highlight was Alan's Devar Torah. Knowing that he was ill with esophageal cancer and taking on the story of Korach and finding comfort in that story. In as people ask the question, why was Korach punished? Why did this terrible thing happen to Korach? And he identified and said, oh, there's no why to these questions. There's no answer. Why do I have cancer? Why am I going to die young? And he died in his 60s. And he found real comfort in noting that this is the human condition and delivered a really moving, beautiful Devar Torah. So we honor his memory and we honor Paula and are grateful she's watching. And it is a great pleasure to have as our scholar this year, a good colleague, friend, Rabbi Toba Spitzer, who many of you already know. We have had collaborations with Congregation Dorshei Tzedek, which I want to welcome the Dorshei Tzedek folks, because many of them are also on Zoom. These are dedicated people because they've heard Toba talk about everything in this book for the last 10 years, and they're still coming to hear her talk about the book, which I think is another testament to what an amazing book it is. This is a book that every rabbi I know, at least every Reconstructionist rabbi, has been waiting for someone to write, and no one could have written it better than Toba. God is Here, Reimagining the Divine, cracks open ways to think about God that can help us get over that terrible, terrible obstacle of God is He, God is an old man, God does miracles, and you're going to be introduced to an amazing text full of wit and wisdom, personal stories, Jewish texts, and I firmly believe that among all of Toba's accomplishments and being counted as the top 50 rabbis in the country and the first lesbian to be the head of a rabbinic association and all of her accomplishments at Dorshei Tzedek, This book is going to have the greatest impact, and we hope that you read it and you share it, and that we all come to understand that God is truly here. So, without further ado, Rabbi Toba Spitzer.
Thank you. From your mouth to God's metaphoric ear. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I was saying to Barbara, last time I was here, it was just me and Barbara all alone in the sanctuary on Zooming on Slichot, so it's nice to be here with humans, other humans in the room, and folks zooming in. Yeah, so I'd like to do is, are you hearing okay on Zoom? Everything good? Yeah? Everything good? Awesome. I wanted to try to tell you my journey to how I got to writing the book, and then share a little bit of the book, and then I'd love to open it up for questions and conversation. So the first thing I should say, because I'm in a Reconstructionist context, is that Mordecai Kaplan really runs throughout this book. He's not mentioned. I probably should have mentioned him in the acknowledgments, but it's not a scholarly book, and it's not just for Jews. And I just thought dropping Mordecai Kaplan in there wouldn't necessarily be helpful. But something I read of Kaplan's probably when I was still back in rabbinical school was really helpful for me. And in this little piece in Future of the American Jew, written in the 1940s, Kaplan talks about. He uses the word belief, but he really means experience. He says, we have to distinguish between experience of the divine and conception of the divine. And he says, experience of the divine, I'm completely paraphrasing because Kaplan is really hard to understand, but basically what he said was this. Experience of the divine is a basic human experience that occurs in all places and at all times. All people have this experience. He says the conception, however, how we think about that, how we talk about that, changes. Now, and just that very simple distinction, which doesn't seem that radical, was really very helpful to me. I came to part from Kaplan in a certain way because Kaplan goes on to, he was a product of his time, the early 20th century, very much a progressivist in the sense of, humans are getting better all the time. My guess is if he was alive right now, he might not be thinking that, but he gives an example of how fire was personified by the Greeks, right? Fire was a god, and then in the medieval period, it was thought to be a substance, phlogiston, and that now we know that fire is a process, right? A process of oxidation. And he says there's no reason we can't, so just as God was once personified, we can now understand God as a process. And so fire is still fire, and God is still God, but we can change from thinking about it as, as a person to thinking about it as a process. So that was Kaplan's sort of chidush, his innovation. So based on Kaplan, I got very involved in something called process theology, which makes an appearance in the book, which talks about God in process, God as process. And what I was seeking was, it was personal and it was also professional. I was a rabbi for people who are sitting in this room, who are zooming in, who are intelligent, thoughtful, contemporary Jews who believe in science and just run up against this God of the Bible and are like, I can't believe in that. That just doesn't make sense. So my quest was like, well, what's a God that can make sense? And God is process or God is power, seemed to make more sense. Then I walked into a bookstore. It was Porter Square Books, give them a shout out, they're worker owned. Walked in, and on the staff picks table was a book called I is an Other, it's a very long subtitle, something like The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes How We See the World, or something like that. And I was interested in metaphor. I knew about it. I knew about the work of George Lakoff. And in this, so it's a book by James Geary, and this was around 2011, I think. I read the book, and in the book, Geary summarizes the work of cognitive linguistics, and I'm not a cognitive linguist, and if anyone here is, you'll correct me if I make mistakes, but the basic contention of cognitive linguists, beginning with George Lakoff and Mark Johnson in 1980, was that metaphor, we have to understand what metaphor is. Metaphor is not just a part of speech. Metaphor is not just a literary, sort of embellishment. Metaphor actually structures how we experience, see, understand, talk about the world. And then I went and read Lakoff and Johnson's sort of foundational work called Metaphors We Live By. And the argument they make in that book, and at the time they were basing this totally on linguistic patterns, was that to say anything about anything, we need metaphors. There's very little we can say that's not metaphorical. We can say, this is hard. There's very basic physical things we can say. But if we're going to talk about our emotions, if we're going to talk about life, if we're going to talk about love, if we're going to talk about ideas, We need metaphors, and we use them all the time. And what they call metaphors we live by are these metaphors that we use all the time without thinking. She's a very warm person. I think you all know what I mean when I say that, and you don't think I mean that when I put my hand on her, like my hand gets hot. We know that it's emotional. Well, what's that based in? It's based in an early infant experience of being held against someone's body when we're infants, and so our brains literally, register emotional closeness and physical warmth. So she's a very warm person. We say I'm feeling up when we're feeling good, because when we're feeling good, we're usually more or less up, whether we're sitting up or standing up, and when we're feeling lousy, we're lying down. So happy is up, sad is down. I think the best example of this I find is the metaphor, time is a precious resource, or time is money, because this metaphor did not exist a few hundred years ago. This metaphor began to exist, with the Industrial Revolution, with people being paid for their time. And this is a great example, I think, of how a metaphor, we don't just say it, we experience it, right? How do I spend my time? I need to budget my time. I'm wasting my time, right? We actually think we're wasting our time. You can't waste time, right? That's ridiculous, right? It's not a definition. Time is not actually a precious resource. It's actually endless. But because of that metaphor, we don't always experience time that way. Sometimes we experience time as a flow that's, endless in both directions. But when we're in it, we experience time, as a precious resource. So that was just interesting. That had anything to do with God. The God moment was this. So in the book, James Gary describes uses the analogy of volcanoes to talk about different kinds of metaphors. So he says an active volcano, an active metaphor is a metaphor that we know it's a metaphor. In the book, I use an example from a Mary Oliver poem, The Dark Hug of Time. Like, we know that time doesn't really hug us, so that's an obvious poetic metaphor. Then he talks about dormant volcanoes or dormant metaphors, that when we say them, we know they're metaphors, but they're just so they're just so, just sort of common in our speech that we know what it means in our culture. So I'm up a creek without a paddle. Like, I'm not actually in a boat right now, but if I say that, what's coming across. Then he talks about extinct metaphors, and extinct metaphors are what I just talked about, these metaphors we live by. She's a warm person, I'm saving time, I'm budgeting time. My favorite is anger is a hot liquid in a container. That's it's like, you're like, what? I'm steaming mad, she blew her top. So you're saying extinct metaphors are these metaphors that they're so embedded in our experience and our speech that we have no idea. We are completely unconscious that they're metaphors. And in that moment, I was like, God is an extinct metaphor. That's the problem. The problem is that when we're arguing about God, when we're saying we believe in God or we don't believe in God, it doesn't really matter. What we're really arguing about is a metaphor. God is a big person. That's what we're really arguing about. We're not talking about our experience of the sacred. We're not talking about the moments when we feel touched by holiness. We're talking about an idea and a metaphor. And then my project changed. So it's like, well, now my project is not to come up with the way to talk about God. It's just that we need more metaphors, right? Metaphors aren't wrong or right. They're not bad or good. They're just metaphors. Sometimes it's lovely to think about God as a big person, God as a parent or as a beloved or as a teacher. There's nothing wrong with those metaphors, but those metaphors can't handle every situation. Not every metaphor works in every situation. So, and this is really when the Dorsey folks came into play. I sort of discovered this, and I was like, well, what other metaphors are there? I started, looking at Tanakh and Hebrew Bible, and it's like, there's lots. Our ancestors were, so this is where I part from Kaplan. Kaplan sort of saw us on this, when it came to theology, he was right with Maimonides. Every generation is more sophisticated than the last one, and, and the more abstract you get, the closer you are to the divine. I realized it was quite the opposite, I think. That I think the ancients, the people who wrote the Torah, who wrote the Bible, had extremely powerful experiences of the sacred that we probably can't imagine. It was very clear, it was near to them, like it wasn't distant, it could sort of all of a sudden you're talking, I don't know, you have an experience and you realize you're in the presence of Yud Hey Vav Hey, that's the experiences being recounted in the Bible. And to get at those experiences, to try to articulate these experiences that were really beyond speech, they use many, many metaphors. So that became like the exploration. I started teaching it, we started having these classes, and it really was very transformative for people. So finally, 10 years later, I said, okay, I better write a book because there's only so many people I can teach. So let me tell you what metaphors do, and then and what they are, and then I'm going to read a little bit. So if you walk away with these key points, it'll be good. We need metaphor to get at complex, abstract human experiences. We can't talk about them. We can't even experience them without metaphor. That's number one. Number two, for big aspects of our lives, no one metaphor will do, right? We need multiple metaphors for anger, for love, for time, for life, for all of these things. You can't, there's no way that complex human experiences can be summed up with one metaphor. New metaphors shape new reality. Like the example of time is a precious resource. If you've been in cultures or societies where that is not a metaphor, people standing by the road for a bus do not feel like they're wasting their time. I have no idea what they're experiencing because I can't experience that, but I know they're having a different experience than I am because that's just not a metaphor, and it's not how they experience that. Metaphors are not true or false. They shape our thought and our action. This is really important. So the metaphors we use for the divine, they don't prove or disprove God's existence. They shape how we act in the world, and therefore that's important. Metaphor is not a definition. Again, it's an articulation of our experience. And finally, metaphor is always grounded in embodied experience. What is being metaphorized is abstract or conceptual or complicated. The metaphor itself is something embodied. I'm going to give, so anger is a hot liquid in a container. Another one is anger is a horse. Like, anger is a horse, that's ridiculous. You need to rein in your anger. She harnessed her anger. Again, but it comes from a physical embodied action that we've had of riding a horse, or that some people have had. So we begin in the body, and then we go out from there. And when we go back to the Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible, we see that these were people writing this who were connected to a land, connected to an actual place, and brought that embodied experience. So I'm just going to read a little bit with your permission, and then we'll open it up. Here we go. Many years ago, I worked at an ice cream store in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On any given day, we had over 20 flavors of ice cream available, and we were always experimenting with new ones. One day, a father and his young son, this is Christina's, by the way, in Inman Square. One day, a father and his young son came into the store. The little boy, not yet able to read, asked his dad, "What flavors are there?" The father looked up at our wonderful list of flavors of the day and answered, "There's chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry." While I sympathized with the dad trying to not overwhelm his child with too many choices, I felt so sad for that little boy. Here was a diverse world of marvelous ice cream flavors hidden from him only because he couldn't read. It's how I feel about most people's experience of God metaphors. If our only flavor choices are God is a distant ruler, or God is an all-powerful and perfect being that we can't really understand, I'd probably walk out of the store. But the happy reality is that our religious tradition offers the equivalent of Baskin-Robbins' 31 flavors when it comes to metaphors for God. And nothing is stopping us from discovering new metaphors that are relevant, powerful, and meaningful to our lives today. So in the first two chapters, I sort of lay out everything I've just told you. And then the rest of the book really are the metaphors. And what I discovered in teaching this over the years was that, we start with text. We start with metaphors that are handed down to us mostly in a religious sacred text. That mostly the Bible. One of the metaphors is rabbinic. The last chapter is contemporary. But that we have to sort of bring them to life again. This is not an intellectual exercise. We have to make the metaphors live. So every chapter is about a metaphor. I bring the text, I bring some stories, and then practices to get this, back into our bodies, back into our hearts. So there's God as water, as makom, place, as voice, as rock, as cloud, as fire, as becoming, and then to contemporary ones, electricity and GPS. So I'll just read selections from a couple chapters just so you sort of get a little flavor of it, and then we'll open it up. So I think I usually start with water, but I'm getting tired of starting with water. So I'm gonna start with rock. This chapter is called Rock of My Heart. In the winter of 2017, I began visiting people being detained in a local prison for various immigration violations, and sometimes for no violation at all. I met a Guatemalan father of 4 who had been living and working in the US for decades without any trouble, an elderly Iraqi man with serious health problems, lesbians from Uganda seeking asylum from the horrifying abuse they'd experienced at home, None had done anything particularly wrong, yet they were stuck in this prison for months, often separated from their spouses and children, the threat of deportation hanging over them. Each person, each story was different, but what struck me about so many of these people was their incredible faith in God. Separated from their families and community, having no idea how long they would be in this situation, they somehow held on. They had a palpable sense of God's presence with them, even or especially in their darkest moments. While I was ostensibly the religious figure in the visiting room, on more than one occasion, I felt that the faith of the person sitting across from me far exceeded my own. The image that came to me in those moments was of God as these people's rock, their refuge and strength. There are numerous biblical verses in which God is called rock, and many seem as if they were written by people in circumstances similar to those I met in prison. And these are some quotes from Psalms. "To you, Adonai, I cry, my rock, do not be silent to me. For if you are silent to me, I will be like those who go down into the pit. Save me quickly, be for me a rock of refuge. For you are my rock and my fortress. Be for me a sheltering rock that I can always come to." For the detainees I visited, God as sheltering rock was a source of strength and resilience, a fortress protecting them from despair, a rock of refuge during lonely and confusing times. The biblical metaphor of God as rock is associated with a time of fear and struggle in the early life of King David. Before he became king, the young David was forced to flee into the wilderness, pursued by a jealous and increasingly paranoid King Saul. He hid in caves and rocky places in the Judean desert for many months before finally emerging victorious. The book of Samuel, which recounts David's long and complex life, includes a poem prayer in David's voice, quote, "on the day that Adonai delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul." In this poem, David says, quote, "Adonai is my rock and my fortified place, a rescuer for me. My God is my rock, I take refuge in it, my shield and the strength that saves me, my fortress and refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence." This poem also appears in the book of Psalms, and indeed many of the Psalms that call on God as rock are attributed to David. Perhaps there was a tradition associating David's experience of seeking shelter in the craggy cliffs of the Judean desert with the image of God as rock. A personal experience of finding refuge gave shape to an enduring metaphor for divine shelter and protection. In turn, this metaphor has spoken to many others seeking safety from harm. The refrain of a powerful African-American spiritual rooted in the experience of slavery draws directly on the biblical tradition of God as rock. "My God is a rock in the weary land in the weary land. My God is a rock in the weary land, shelter in the time of storm." I first heard this sung by Bessie Jones of the Georgia Sea Island Singers, recorded in 1961. Jones, born in 1902, most likely learned this song from her grandfather, Jet Sampson, who as a child was kidnapped in Africa and brought to America as a slave. Sampson passed on to his granddaughter songs and other cultural traditions from his time on plantations in Virginia and Georgia. I wonder what it must have been like for Bessie Jones to hear these words sung by a man who had survived slavery, who had experienced emancipation and the promise of Reconstruction, and then the violence and despair of Jim Crow. What must that image of God as a sheltering rock have meant to Mr. Sampson as he endured the oppression of slavery and its aftermath? What inspiration and hope did it give Ms. Jones and her contemporaries as they added their voices to the struggle for African-American civil rights in the 1950s and 60s? The legacy of God as rock is a powerful one. Whatever our own experiences of suffering, the metaphor of rock offers the possibility of finding protection and shelter when we feel besieged and weak, a place of rest in the weary land of our lives. It attests to a power that literally grounds us in the solidity of the earth. The sheltering rock that I can always come to promises that in the turmoil and pain of this world, healing can be found. I'm going to jump to place, earlier chapter. So most of the metaphors I explore here are from the Bible. Makom, place, is an interesting one. It's rabbinic, and I don't know exactly where it came from. It just, by the time we get to the Mishnah, which is written down in the year 200, around the year 200, the rabbis just call God Makom, HaMakom, and we still say it, right? If you know the traditional greeting and sort of condolence message when someone dies, HaMakom Yenachem Etchem, right? May the place comfort you. We say it all the time, but we don't stop and say like the place comfort you. What kind of a weird name for God is the place? What does that mean? It might be based in there's a couple places in Torah where there's hints of this. Most it's not explicit, but the most maybe powerful places there's Jacob, the story of Jacob when he's running away from home, and he has a powerful experience of the divine. He experiences a ladder with angels going up about it. When he wakes up, he says, there is Adonai in this place, in this place. So I don't know how it came to be, but Makom is a name for the divine. And again, I decided, well, what if I take that seriously? What if I really think about God as place? So this is from the chapter on God as place. When I was in elementary school, I spent a lot of time in the woods near my house. Along with my dog, I would climb on rocks in the stream bed, walk along the paths, and sit under trees and make up songs. It was a fairly small woods, surrounded by houses and even some high-rise apartments, but in certain spots and at certain seasons, I could pretend I was off in an expansive forest, far from civilization. The woods were my refuge, my creative place, a kind of second home. Thinking back, I'm somewhat amazed at how much time I spent there. To this day, my soul feels nourished when I'm in the woods, surrounded by trees, listening to a stream as it rushes over the stones. This is the power of place, whether it's the woods or a bedroom, a summer camp, or a beloved classroom. Each of us can conjure up places that have played a special role in our lives. I can still remember the moment and the look on his face when I took my then 11-year-old nephew to Fenway Park for the first time. Each time I visit Israel, I encounter smells and visceral sensations that take me back to my first time living there when I was 18. If I think back to all the places I've lived over the course of my life, whether for years or a few months, each functions as a memorable way station on this journey of my life. When I ask people to tell me about their God beliefs, often they have no idea what to say, or they simply say they don't believe in God. But if I ask them to describe a spiritual experience they've had, whatever that may mean to them, many will tell me about special places in their lives. So perhaps it shouldn't be so surprising that by the early rabbinic period, the epithet HaMakom, the place, had become a fairly well-known Jewish name for God. In the Mishnah, the earliest compilation of rabbinic teachings, there are instructions for prayer that include this comment, quote, "The ancient pious ones would meditate for an hour and then pray in order to direct their heart to HaMakom, the place." Another early teaching is recorded in the Talmud in a discussion of what to say to people who are ill. Quote, Rabbi Judah would say, "May HaMakom, the place, have compassion upon you and all who are sick." But what exactly does it mean to call God the place? What are we to make of this metaphor? For the rabbis of the Mishnah, HaMakom was a name for God that implied a sense of God's nearness and love. They used the name HaMakom when they were talking about seeking compassion for themselves or others, when they gave a blessing of comfort to someone who was suffering, and when talking about how people should relate to one another. What is a place? It is a physical space in which we experience ourselves in relation to that which is around us. Certain spaces make us feel contained and supported. They provide a structure within which we experience a sense of protection or refuge. Other spaces can make us feel our own smallness and give us a sense of wonder at the vastness that surrounds. A sacred place can be one especially designated for worship, or a place in nature by the ocean or on a mountaintop. It might be a place where, like Jacob, we had a memorable, holy experience. But the most important thing about place is that we're always in one. The underlying irony of calling God HaMakom, the place, is that there isn't just one place to encounter godliness. That can happen in any place. Place is here in this moment, right where we are. The metaphor of God as place invites us to open ourselves to the potential godliness of any and every moment, in any place we might find ourselves. And then I'm just going to read one more little piece about place. When Moses, so I am jumping ahead, there's a moment when Moses asks to encounter God's presence on Sinai. It's right after the episode of the Golden Calf. And God says, you can't You can't see me, but you're gonna experience me, and I'm gonna invite you into a place. And God says, Hine makom iti. Here, there is a place with me. So it's a little bit about that. When Moses asks to see God's presence, he is in the midst of trying to repair a significant breach in the relationship between God and the Israelite people, a breach caused by the creation of the golden calf. In this moment, Moses is seeking compassion for both himself and his people. In response, Adonai invites him into a place where he hears God's true name: compassion and mercy, patience and loving kindness, truth and endless forgiveness. Sometimes I like to read Torah stories the way a therapist once told me to interpret dreams, to assume all of the characters are me. In this story, the Israelites are that part of me that screws up, that goes astray, the part I get angry at and frustrated with. Moses is my better nature, the part of me that realizes that continually berating myself isn't particularly productive. And Yud He Vav He, Adonai is the source of compassion that I can draw on, my own capacity for compassion to which I always have access. The makom into which the Moses part of me is invited is this place of compassion. What I have learned over the years is that with practice, it is possible to increase my capacity for compassion and loving response. In the metaphor of makom, it is possible to expand this space within myself, a godly place of compassion and loving kindness for myself and others. I like to imagine this space as my own heart. So maybe you already get a little flavor of it, but what happens when I started exploring the metaphors is they speak to different parts of our experience. You know, God as rock is really, a lot of it is really about refuge. It's about having something solid either underneath us. Sometimes we're on the rock, sometimes we're leaning against the rock. You know, you can think about your own experience with rocks. There's other parts of that, other things that metaphor speaks to. Makom is always associated with compassion in rabbinic literature. The metaphor of makom is always about compassion for self and others, and a different being in a place of compassion. I think the last thing I'm going to read before we talk is from the last chapter, which is again, I wanted to do a couple modern metaphors. So this is God as electricity. A few years into my rabbinate, I was on a retreat with about 30 other rabbis from across the Jewish denominations. On the opening night, we did a get-to-know-you exercise in which we had a series of 3-minute conversations with one another, each with a different prompt. As I moved around the circle of colleagues, I prepared to answer the question: if you hadn't become a rabbi, and money or ability or prerequisite knowledge was not an issue, what would you have been? I was pretty sure I was going to say I'd have been a community organizer. I had worked in a variety of progressive organizations before going to rabbinical school, and I identified as a social justice activist. So imagine my surprise when it was my turn to answer this question, and what came out of my mouth was, I would have been a physicist. The reason I found this completely surprising is that I am terrible at math and never got anywhere near a physics class in my high school or college years. There is no one less likely to have become a physicist than me. But after I gave my answer, I realized that I do share something with those who are blessed to do physics: a sense of wonder at the universe and a deep desire to understand how things work. As a rabbi, I get to engage in big questions, and I seek to discern some kind of meaningful order in what often feels like a disordered, chaotic world. I want to know what makes us tick and what the larger context is for human existence. And while I can't really fathom what physicists do, I wonder if some of the same desires and curiosity are at play. When I read the Hebrew Bible, I imagine that its authors were sort of like me and sort of like modern physicists, seeking answers to how the cosmos works and what our place in it is. Their experience of the divine was part of that exploration. It was, in fact, inseparable from it. Science offers metaphors that help me understand some of the more challenging aspects of the biblical portrayal of God. Among the most difficult stories in the Bible are those in which seemingly unsuspecting characters get zapped by God. A good example is the story of Nadav and Avihu that I described earlier in the book. Aaron's oldest sons make an unauthorized offering at the altar and are immediately consumed by divine fire. Something similar happens in the book of Samuel, when King David attempts to bring the Ark of the Covenant, a golden box holding the stone tablets that Moses received at Sinai, to his capital city of Jerusalem. The Ark is being transported on an ox cart, and when the oxen stumble, one of the men guiding the cart, a guy named Uzzah, reaches out to steady the Ark. When he touches it, Adonai is incensed and strikes him down, and Uzzah dies. This story seems even worse than the episode with Nadav and Avihu. They at least could be accused of making a dubious offering in an irresponsible way. All that poor Uzzah did was try to keep the Holy Ark from falling out of a cart. Why in the world would God strike him down? Earlier in the Bible, the Israelites are warned that only the tribe of the Levites are authorized to transport the various items of the Mishkan, the Holy Tabernacle. And the men responsible for transporting the ark, via a set of poles fastened to rings on its sides, have to be extremely careful not to actually touch it, or they will die. When God strikes Uzzah in the story of the ox cart, it seems to be the unavoidable consequence of someone touching a holy object that is profoundly dangerous to humans. The best that I can understand how the ancient Israelites understood this holy danger is through the metaphor of electricity. The Holy of Holies at the center of the Mishkan housed the ark, which functions something like the core of a nuclear reactor, supplying the sacred energy that was then channeled by the priests through their rituals. Just as enormous precautions have to be taken to safely make use of nuclear energy, so too did those who interacted with the Mishkan and the ark at its center have to take extreme care not to get zapped. When the book of Samuel describes God being, quote, incensed, and that's the Hebrew word, when Uzzah touches the ark, we can understand it less as the emotion of anger and more like a natural physical reaction. It's akin to me being able to safely use the electric power that is supplied to my home as long as it is wired and grounded properly. I need to avoid sticking my finger in a socket. Hapless Uzzah had the best of intentions, but by touching the ark, he did the biblical equivalent of holding up a metal rod in a lightning storm and got a shock that took his life. The question remains, why did the authors of the Bible perceive godly power as so inherently dangerous? What truth were they trying to convey in these metaphors of fire and electricity and the stories of zapping that happens to people both innocent and guilty? My answer is that the biblical authors are acknowledging a simple reality. To be alive is pretty damn scary. We exist in a universe that is largely, even today, beyond our understanding. We are often at the mercy of forces we cannot control. The ancients were very honest about God, and the Bible is not a Hallmark greeting card. It is a holy, sometimes contradictory muddle of beauty and horror, love and pain, hope and hopelessness, a lot like life. And somewhere within and beyond all of this complexity is Yod He Vav He, the source of life itself. As the prophet Isaiah audaciously declared, quote, forming light and creating darkness, making peace and creating destruction, I, Yod He Vav He, do all these things. There is only one power source of the universe, the prophet teaches. It manifests in that which we find pleasant and in that which scares us. It both sustains us and makes us mortal. And just as with electrical current, if we don't properly channel that divine power, we can generate some severe shocks. As the world witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, when human beings start playing with the primal energies of the universe, we take on godlike powers of both creation and destruction. Perhaps the Bible was right in warning us that there are some things that we humans should just not touch. So why don't I pause there? Questions, thoughts, challenges? Why don't we start with folks in the room, and then maybe, and if people on Zoom have a question or a comment, put it in the chat, and we'll and Rabbi Barber's gonna check on it. Anybody here have a question or a thought? I'm gonna bring the mic over if you do, so everybody can hear. Thank God, they're in stunned silence. Any questions? Go for it, Tammy. Thank you.
I found the two selections that you highlighted interesting in God as a rock and God as the place, a place, God, hamakom. Mm-hmm. Because I think of a rock as being such a permanent, if it's large, immovable, you know, it's a set thing. As you said, you can sit on it, you can lean against it. It's a real physical, tough, rough, heavy thing, mm-hmm. which is a real contrast to the nature of hamakom, mm-hmm. which can be not quite malleable, but certainly mm-hmm. flexible, and it's everywhere, and it's airy and breezy, and it's in many ways the exact opposite of a rock.
Yes, exactly.
So I don't have a specific question. It was
No,
I
I'm really
thought an
glad-
interesting juxtaposition of these two,
Yep.
in my mind, significant contrasts.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly the point. Like, because sometimes we feel heavy and we need something solid to lean on, and sometimes we're in a very different place. And I think, let me read a little bit from Cloud. That's why we need all these different metaphors, right? Because to say that anyone, because again, I think we so desperately want a definition. We want to say God is this, it's like this. And what I often notice is that people are drawn to one metaphor or the other because it lines up more or less with how they already think about God. And I really challenge people to like try a different metaphor, because I know I'm turning 60 this year. Like, the experiences I'm having now are not the experiences I was having when I was 20, or 30 or 40, and in different times of our life, or when we have a certain life experience, something else comes up. Let me read a little bit from Cloud, because there cannot be anything more different than a rock than cloud. So let's see. And one of the chapters is God as sound. It's completely different. Like God as vibration, as voice. So Cloud was a really interesting one. Let me read a little bit of Cloud. In the early months of 2020, I was on sabbatical, taking a few months off from my congregational work to focus on writing this book. I returned on March 10th, just in time for the Jewish holiday of Purim and a big Purim party. 5 days later, the congregation, along with much of Massachusetts, was physically shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those first few weeks brought many challenges and a lot of learning. I had to figure out how to lead Shabbat services via Zoom, how to guide and comfort congregants unable to be physically present with their ill and dying parents, how to create B'nai Mitzvah ceremonies with me in one place and the family in another. The question that accompanied me in all of my work with my congregation was this: how do we foster a sense of closeness to one another, to our community, to Jewish practice, when we can't be physically close? That spring, as I taught a Zoom class about God in metaphor, I realized that the same question was very much alive for my biblical ancestors. They seemed to have experienced Yud-He Vav-He as a presence that could be closely felt, that could not be held in a material object, in an idol made of metal or wood or clay. The divine could be glimpsed but not fully seen, heard but not entirely comprehended, encountered but not contained. With the metaphor of cloud, the biblical authors found a way to convey a sense of nearness to something close by that cannot be touched. I'll just jump a few pages ahead. During a family vacation in Puerto Rico, my spouse Gina and I took our kids for a hike in El Yunque National Forest, a tropical rainforest in the Luquillo Mountains. It is a beautiful area, sacred to the indigenous Taino people. We climbed up the El Yunque peak, and arriving at the top, felt disappointed when we couldn't see anything at all. The view was completely obscured by clouds as we sat and rested on the rocks. We were about to give up and head back when all of a sudden the clouds swept away, and we found ourselves gazing at a magnificent panorama. A few minutes later, the clouds returned, and we could barely see a foot in front of us. Dense fog, and then a view, fog, and then view. This magical oscillation continued as we sat within the cloud. It is in the nature of clouds to obscure things from view, while also making something that is usually invisible, visible. I just want you to think about that as a metaphor for the divine. It is in the nature of clouds to obscure things from view, while also making something that is usually invisible, visible. As the folks at NASA explain, water vapor is always in the sky in some amount, but is invisible. Clouds form when an area of air becomes cooler until the water vapor there condenses to liquid form. At that point, the air is said to be saturated with water vapor. The air where the cloud forms must be cool enough for the water vapor to condense. The water will condense around things like dust, ice, or sea salt, all known as condensation nuclei. The temperature, wind, and other conditions where a cloud forms determine what type of cloud it will be. The authors of the Bible most likely did not know all of the science behind the formation of clouds, but they understood an aspect of reality that this scientific definition of clouds makes clear: that something life-sustaining and ever-present, whether water vapor or the divine, can be both unseen and very much there. Indeed, it is when the water vapor in the atmosphere both cools down and interacts with other objects in the atmosphere, dust, ice, salt, that it becomes visible as a cloud. So too, the biblical texts about God as cloud imply that Yud-He Vav-He's invisible presence becomes visible when it interacts with human beings. And so once I realized that, I started looking where God appears as cloud. And again, we sort of, we know about the pillar of cloud, in the desert. We've read all these things, but I realized whenever there's some kind of interaction directly between God and the Israelites or God and Moses, God almost always appears as a cloud. And again, I think it's this beautiful metaphor of, right, what is a cloud? You're in a cloud, you can't, it's there, but you can't touch it. It's a beautiful metaphor, right? And it's totally different than rock, right? It's like the opposite. And I think this is the point about all of these. And they get at different experiences. And at the end of each chapter, I have practices that try to get at some of these experiences. I think, cloud has a lot to do with impermanence, with that sense of lightness, whereas rock is much more about solidity and refuge. And again, these are all parts of our experience, and I think parts of the ways that we might, encounter the divine. Other questions? Was anybody in Zoom have any questions or comments?
Should we unmute and ask?
Oh yeah, go for it. All right, Zoomer, introduce yourself and then ask a question.
Yeah, and I threw it in the chat, so I'm going to try to read it. This is Rich Moshe. I really appreciate what you did with metaphor. It's very beautiful, so thank you for that. And I was asking about practices that in my mind try to move beyond metaphor. I spent a lot of time on Buddhist teachings and also sort of analogous teachings in Jewish tradition. So breath or awareness, being, focusing on nigun. Are those practices, do they sneakily have metaphor buried in them? Or they attempt to transcend metaphor to direct experience? You could say that God is, in the melody, but I think it really is sort of more of a direct experience. So I'm wondering how you think about these practices relative to the concept of metaphor.
Yeah, they're all in the book. Every single practice you mentioned. Because you can't get beyond metaphor. Again, I think this is our bias. We've been taught that metaphor is a literary construct and that it's not real. Right? There's reality and there's metaphor, which is about reality. And what I'm trying to suggest, and I think the cognitive linguists say, is you cannot get beyond metaphor. We cannot exist without metaphor. We can't think, we can't function without metaphor. The practices aren't about getting beyond metaphor, they're about embodying the metaphor, right? So for example, so I'll just give it a direct example. So one practice in the chapter about makom, about place, is how do we connect to place? I suggest a walking meditation to focus on place. I mean, mindfulness practice is about being embodied and about noticing our bodies, right? It's not about leaving our bodies. And then I suggest if people want to add the phrase mano ra hamakom hazeh, how awesome is this place, you can bring the biblical story of place in, but you're doing the walking meditation. In the chapter about God as voice, there's nigun practice. So yes, the practices are to help us re-embody the metaphor and bring them alive, because they're not ideas. They're really about experience. And I think things are in there, they're in the text. And we say that on Shabbat, one of the Psalms we say is sing to the rock. I have to imagine that was a practice. Otherwise, why were they talking about singing to rocks? So they had some kind of practice with rocks of singing to them and speaking to them. They tell the rock not to be silent to them. I don't know. Rocks are not inanimate. Rocks are animate. They're just really, really slow, right? It's on a different time scale. They do change. They're not inanimate. I got to be present at the creation of a sweat lodge once, and I watched the Native American gentleman creating it, asking permission of the rocks as he moved them. In his tradition, there's spirit in the rocks. So I feel like, for me, all those practices you mentioned, which to me are very foundational practices, my own spiritual practice, I try to think about which of those practices would help us re-embody the metaphor, and that's why I bring them there. So it's to not get beyond the metaphor, quite the opposite, it's to embody the metaphor. And there's prayer practices, and there's using the names. There are names. There's in the water chapter, there's a lot of water names of God. There are rock names. There are lots of rock names. Sur Levavi, Sur Yisrael, Sur Goali. I mean, they're all over the place. And I think these were names that our ancestors were using. And we need to, again, they're in our prayer book. We just don't take them seriously. That's all I really did. I just said, what if we took these seriously and started actually interacting with them as if they actually mean something? And lo and behold, they did mean something. And then I had to figure out, and I did this, again, with a lot of folks at Dorsey, as we started to do the practices. And I'll just give an example of how just one person, who I don't even know who it is, to be honest, it wasn't a congregant, told me a story about this and how I came to see that this could be quite transformative. So it was my first year teaching this. We were doing place, we were doing makom. We studied the text very closely about Jacob having his encounter in the godly place, and then and then we did some journaling about places that were special to us, and then I just sent people home to think about place. I can't remember what the assignment was. The next week, this woman who was in the class, who I don't even remember her name, she wasn't a Dorsey member. I never saw her again, but she came to me, and I knew she went to another shul, and she told me that whenever she got to the Shema in the service, she didn't say it, because she didn't believe in God, and she just felt weird, like saying this prayer, which is about Adonai as well. So she just would never say that. She would just be quiet. So she said this time, after our class on Makom, she went to services, again, not with me, somewhere else. And during all the prayers leading up to Shema, she says, I'm very connected to place. So I just brought to mind like all these places that are very special to me. She said, and when we got to the Shema, I brought them all together into one. And she said, I had an experience I'd never had before of my life, of God. And I was like, whoa, I was like, it works. I didn't tell her to do that. Like, she just came up with it. Just that metaphor really spoke to her very, very deeply. So that to me is an example of a practice. And I've been teaching this. I've been teaching this to social justice activists, and they've been doing practices. But that's the powerful part. So if you do get the book, I really encourage you to not just read it, but do the practices. And at the end of the book, I say start the book again, and spend time. And again, and notice which metaphors you're drawn to. Notice which metaphors maybe don't work that well, and try them anyway, because it might be about an experiential piece that might be important for you to engage with. But yeah, it's quite interesting how the practices interact with the metaphors. Yeah, would you grab the mic if you're going to speak, and then Hillary after. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to bring up a challenge that I have for myself, and maybe a possible answer to myself.
Okay. Oh, good.
Based on
we're going to listen to you talk to yourself. Okay, go for
it. Exactly. Listening to me talk to myself. So, okay, so you're talking about, I really do have to read the book, and I have to read the practices, because I think that will really resonate with me. So you talk about like the walking meditation as an example. So why do I even need to have this concept or even experience of this thing called God, or even worry about a metaphor or a not metaphor? Just do the meditation practices and yoga and the other things that I do. Why do I have to attach it to this thing called God? Okay, so one of the problems I have with that idea, which I've had for many years, is I come to shul and I pray all the prayers about praying to God. And it's very interesting that you gave that example with the Shema, because I also feel like, what am I doing here? What do you mean God is one? I don't even know what that means. And I find that the prayers that I don't understand the Hebrew work much better for me, because then I'm not translating it into English in my head. I'm just saying them because of tradition and whatever, and then I don't have to worry about, quote unquote, praying to God, because I'm not really praying. I'm just with the congregation and having this experience with the congregation. Okay, so back to my.
So can I offer a response to your question?
Yeah, but so why do I need God?
I'm gonna. It's the very first page of the book. I'm gonna read you the introduction. Yeah, okay. It's a great question. No, it's a completely legitimate question. So here's my introduction to the book. Let's say you walk into a restaurant that you've heard a lot about. You're looking for something to satisfy your hunger and give you strength to get through the day. The waiter hands you the menu and you sit back, scanning all the sections: salads, soups, lunch, dinner. You begin to realize, sadly, that nothing on the menu looks particularly appetizing. The choices sound bland, unsatisfying, or just strange. Much of the menu is incomprehensible. Resigned, or maybe even a little bit angry, you put the menu down and leave. You convince yourself that you're not so hungry after all and head into your day. This is what happens to many of us as we realize we have a spiritual hunger. The body needs food to survive, and while it may not hit us in as obvious a way, our spirits also need to be fed. Yet so often we either don't know where to go to satisfy this hunger, or the places we do know about just don't satisfy. We walk into the restaurant of organized religion and realize there's just too much we can't swallow. We all need a system of meaning to make sense of our lives, to help answer big questions. Why am I here on this earth? What should I be doing to make a difference in the world? How do I instill values that are important to me and my children? What are the right choices to make about work, about what to do with money, about complicated ethical situations? How do I make sense of difficult events in my life, loss and sorrow? In confusing and challenging times, what can I do to bring calm, clarity, and joy into my day-to-day living? Religions of every sort came into existence to help answer these questions. Because every religion came into being in a specific time and place, and were created by specific groups of people, there are differences in how each one answers universal questions about life and death, meaning and morals. What all religions share is an awareness of something both within us and beyond us, a power that shapes and guides our lives, especially if we actively seek it. And then I go on to talk about the God idea that's problematic, that you've articulated beautifully. So the problem is many of us just can't believe in a God like that. We just can't. We won't believe in a big person that controls the world in our own lives like a puppet master. We know that we can turn to science to explain what happens in the natural world. Our own experience tells us that we have free will, that our choices are real. We can't believe in someone or something that we're told is both all-powerful and all good, because when we look around the world, when we look at our own lives, it's very clear there's a whole lot of not good there. So either God is irrelevant, or not so good, or just not very plausible. So we fold up the menu and push back from the table. God doesn't exist, and religion is either obsolete or a force for bad. We take our spiritual hunger somewhere else, where a God belief isn't required, meditation perhaps, or a yoga class, or we try to ignore our spiritual hunger by going shopping or watching TV, or preoccupying ourselves with work or alcohol or sex. This book is my attempt to create a new menu, and here's my answer. Because I believe the hunger is real for most people, even those who say they have no interest in religion or God. I believe we all need spiritual practices to ground us, to make us stronger and more compassionate. I believe religious communities, like this one, can be models for creating the kind of society we want to inhabit, communities where we can live values of justice and love, and teach our children to be good and caring people. I believe all human beings need meaningful rituals to mark important life transitions. And perhaps most importantly, I believe that we need to have language to talk about something that is greater than ourselves and greater than the things that our consumer culture tells us are ultimate. We need to believe in something, and the fact is we all do believe in something. So the question isn't really, should I believe, but rather, what do I believe in? What do I think has ultimate value? To whom and how am I connected beyond the tiny circle of my family? What are my responsibilities to myself, to the people around me, to my city, to the planet? And what is there beyond myself that supports and sustains those values, connections, and commitments? And this is, I think, this last paragraph is my answer to the humanist argument against that. At a time when the human race is confronting the enormity of our destructive power in the context of climate change, we need to reject two myths. First, that a superhero God is going to magically appear and save us. And second, that human beings are so good and so powerful, we can save ourselves. In between those two misconceptions is a deeper, urgent truth. There is something operating both within us and around us that, if understood and accessed properly, can help us foster the wisdom, compassion, and resilience to perhaps save ourselves and our planet. We need to know it by its many names and learn from each of those names what is asked of us. This book is a step towards doing just that. So maybe that's a leap of faith. You know, you could be a humanist and argue against that. I think humanism is problematic because I don't think humans are so great a lot of the time, you know, and I think to do the work we need to do in the world, and sort of the work I do, I know I don't do it by myself. I know there's something being channeled through me. You don't have to, and you don't have to call it God. I say also in the book, if the God word is a Germanic word, it's not our word. Yud-Hey-Vav-Hey is a great word. It's like, you can't define it, you can't limit it. It's fabulous. You know, think of it as electric power. Think of it however you want. But if you completely reject God, if you're really atheist, you know, to the extreme, not, you know, then I think then all that's left is us, and that makes me very sad. So that's why I wrote this book. Hillary was next. So you want to come grab the mic, and then if anybody else on Zoom will be next, and then yeah.
Thanks, Rabbi Toba.
Yeah.
It's great to hear you read. I did read the book, and I do have to go back and pick it up again, because when you're reading it, you think, I have to try this, but then you're trying to get through the book. So I do need to pick it up again. So you're making me think of a lot of questions, but I'll just give you two. One is, can you tell us a little bit about your experience since you've written the book? You know, speaking about, you've been on, you know, with many different communities, and just curious how you're reflecting on it now, since it's a finished, you know, it's finished, it's there, and yet it's a work in progress you're always adding new metaphors probably, so that's one question. And then secondly, a young man who you know since he's a baby, our son, I said, you should really read Rabbi Toba's book. He's like, I'm not reading anything that has anything to do with God. So I'm curious about if you've tried some of these teachings with, the teens or like younger adults and how that's been received.
Yeah, good question. So the book came out in March. I worked on it for about 10 years. And I have to say, I totally agree with you, Barbara. Like God willing, I won't die tomorrow, but if I did, like the book is out. Like that was like this, if there's a life, people say, what are you writing next? I'm like, this is like my life's work. What are you talking about? That's my book. I've been speaking about it some, to be honest, Hillary, what's great now is that other people are teaching it. I mean, that's really why I wrote it, because I would have these random experiences, like people who'd studied this for literally an hour and a half on a Shavuot. I would, met someone like a year later and she's like, oh, Rabbi Toba, like you changed my life. I was like, whoa, like this stuff is powerful. I don't even take credit for it. I just feel like I don't know, I was chosen to be the vessel for it. But so the question was, how do I write a book that's accessible? I think it's pretty, I think you've heard it's written pretty accessibly. And as Barbara was saying, that other people could teach. So one thing I've been trying to do a lot, I've had 2 webinars. I'll probably do some more. I had to create a web page. I even post on Instagram now. It's bizarre, but to help colleagues teach it. So that's really been, I think, the most. It's wonderful to do this, and I've done this in different settings, and that's great. But and people ask me about book tours, but I actually don't want it to be about me. And I'm in this really, thanks to Dorsey Tzedek, I don't have to do this for money. Like I'm not trying to survive on this like some authors, need to from their books. So for me, it's much more, how do I get this out into the world through other clergy and through other educators? So that's what I'm focused on. And I've been teaching this to like our 5th and 6th graders for years. I have no idea what they do with it. I'm just trying to plant some seeds, and I don't explicitly talk about metaphor with them as much, but try to just give them some of these images, because that's what happens. I mean, they shut down, even when they've been educated by us, and we're trying so hard not to. But if I do the next book, it will be a young person's version with pictures. That's my hope. Not young, not little, but like that 5th to 7th, like just when the mind is shutting, sort of rejecting stuff, unfortunately. So that's, so it can be taught to kids, and and what they're rejecting when they reject it, and then I hope Noah will come back to it later. Yeah, would you grab the mic? And Barbara, will you check if and anybody else on Zoom want? Okay, let's do a Zoom person, and then we're going to do it in the room. Actually, we'll do it in the room and then Zoom. Go for it.
The way I'm understanding it, this isn't a particularly Jewish book. You're looking at God, but I don't know where our tradition fits into it.
It's interesting. So I wanted the book to be accessible to anybody.
Right.
Almost every text I mention is a Jewish text in the book. So there's, you heard some biblical text, there's rabbinic text, there's Hasidic texts.
But the concept of God that you're describing.
I'm not describing a concept of God.
Well, the way you're describing reaching some understanding of what God is could be in any tradition.
Is that bad?
No, it's not bad. I'm just trying to grasp where you're going.
I am writing, what I say in the book is I'm writing this from my tradition. Every single metaphor I mention is from the Jewish tradition. Those aren't from another tradition.
Because to me, like I understand when you talked about what religion is, the way I can access it is through my readings. I can't access it through the Quran or through the New Testament because they're not mine. This is mine.
Yeah, you will recognize every text in here.
Yeah, and the other thing, how do you see the stories of the Torah tying into it?
Oh, there's lots of Torah stories in here. Yeah. It's all connected. I'm probably gonna say just read the book because it's a little hard to answer that here, but there's lots of Torah stories in here. God does appear as a human in a lot of Torah stories, but not exclusively by any means. Thank you so much. All right, Zoomer, unmute and introduce yourself so I know who you are.
I can go if I can read what I chatted, if that's okay with everybody, unless someone else.
Sure, will you tell us, I can't see
Yeah.
you, so you can say who you are?
My name is Sarah. I'm a member of HPT, and I'm going to read to you what I put in there. I wrote, I really enjoyed your book. And so, you know, my son is quoting you in his Devar Torah next week. That's pretty cool. My question to you, which might not exactly be very fair to ask, is how does one explain symbolism and that the idea of God can be represented in an infinite amount of ways to someone who has a difficult time with metaphors in the first place? Could it be that the correct metaphor, quote unquote, hasn't been found? Or is it simply more life that needs to be lived, more experiences needed to be had? And I do want to stress this isn't about convincing anyone to believe in God, but more about that feeling of, I put in my chat, the feeling of the divine, but I guess that's just another way of saying God. But maybe that's the point, like of that feeling of holiness.
Yeah, you know, you can't convince someone of an experience. I think, you know, as a teacher, what I do is I share my experiences. If I ask people where or when do you feel a sense of awe? You know, when do you feel a sense of connection? You know, and also I think, and I talk about this in the book, I don't know if it's like a new age thing, but we've come to sort of associate the spiritual with the pleasant. And a lot of deeply spiritual experiences are deeply unpleasant. You know, like death is like, well, you know, confronting mortality is when a lot of people start thinking about these issues. So I'd be careful about associating, you know, religious or spiritual or experience of the sacred only with the pleasant. You know, and in the book I talk about, you know, my spouse's death and dealing with that and how the metaphor of water was helpful to me. So, you know, I don't think you can, it's not to convince anyone. I think, and again, this is not about symbolism, it's about, you know, ways that we encounter the divine. So, but I think I would start with your own experience. If you're talking with someone, talk about experiences you've had. And again, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything in this book. I'm just, like I said in that introduction I read, that I feel like people want this, and the traditional God imagery, traditional God metaphors get in the way. And I'm just, and it's, another analogy I use is, it's like the ancients had this palette of unbelievable colors, and that we're painting with, like, I don't know, burnt orange and light blue. You know, it's like we have two colors, you know, and they had like 100. And it's like, you can paint a picture with burnt orange and blue, I guess, but wouldn't it be like a lot more beautiful if you had access to more colors? So that's really, you know, what the book is trying to do. But it's not a conceptual exercise, you know. So if you can get someone to read it, like Noah, you know, and then get them to like experience it, I think that's why I use a lot of stories. There are texts in it. There's a lot of text not in it. I have folders this big for every metaphor. I had to completely restrain myself, you know, and take out like half the. I was like, I could write a version of this book that was very rabbinic and, you know, full of text, but that's not who it's for. I think it is a very Jewish book, and I have Christian colleagues, and I've been contacted by Muslims who've read it. A lot of the biblical texts are shared with Christians, so it's easier for them. But I got a wonderful email from a Muslim woman who appreciated it. So that was cool. Is there anybody else on Zoom who wanted to share before we come back to the room? Or maybe we'll take one or two more questions.
My name is Fran Levin.
Hey, Fran.
Hi there. Very pleased and honored to be here. I just received your book in the mail, and I'm looking forward to reading it. Hearing you speak takes the words and makes them jump off what will be my reading on the pages, and I appreciate that. The concept of words is so limiting in so many ways, because the words were birthed from an experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment we try to define it and to make it, to give it limits, we remove it from that experience. And trying to get back to that is really difficult. And I think your concept of metaphor and the metaphor of palette of colors really resonates for me. And I strongly encourage you to, and I started to put this in the chat and didn't get, because I wanted to finish, because I wanted to hear what was being said. I encourage you to write for the adolescent minds, which are a what? They are a mire. They are.
That's another book, right?
Yes, it is indeed, that they are pulling away from and trying to define themselves as separate from what they've known. And what they've known, of course, is limited. So for all of us, we kind of assume that everybody lives the life we live and eats the food we eat and has the same stuff we have. And in many ways, when we live in our little areas, that's so true. But the metaphors of reaching out and growing into, and I will say growing up, which is an unending process. We never really grow up, I hope, that we're continuing to grow. But the adolescent mind is searching for things to reach out towards, to reach out from, to, kind of, it's a push-pull. And how that concept of pushing and pulling is integrated becomes our life's work.
Yep.
So thank you for your concept. Metaphors are very important to me, and in so many different ways, as is music that I know we share, as is our words, which I know we share. And I just want to say a great big thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, and I think some adolescents are very open to this. They're as diverse as we are, as we old people are. So
Well, I don't think
yeah.
they need to necessarily be open to it. I think it happens to them, and I think the stories bring them in and give them an opportunity to snatch pieces.
Yep.
They
Yep.
can, they don't have to identify it as from Rabbi Toba. They don't have to identify it as this being God or religion, but it's rich.
Yeah.
And
Thank
those
you.
experiences become incorporated into their lives in ways that we
Yeah.
can't predict what's going to happen.
God
But it'll
willing.
all
God
be
willing.
good if they come from this.
Thank you so much. All right, so there was one more. I think maybe one more question here. Somebody was, yeah, come grab the mic just so folks on Zoom can hear you.
Thank you so much for your book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm really looking forward to reading it and giving us an introduction to it. I'm curious how, for me, what the way I've accessed divine, God, all of that, to a great extent, is through the qualities, ethical qualities.
The midot,
And
the musar.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, or even just the attributes. So I'm curious, how do you integrate, El, Rachum, V'Chanun, like all that, or the God, the healing, the, taking care of the sick, the poor, is that a metaphor, or is that alongside this, or how do ethics come in to these?
Yeah,
ideas?
that's a really good question. How does ethics come into this? Let me read a little. Maybe I'll finish with reading a little bit about that. So it was really interesting when I was really into process theology. There was a lot about process theology I loved, and the book, there's a chapter in the book called Becoming, God Has Ehiyah. That's my process theology chapter, although implicitly. But as Christians, so it was like a lot about love. And I was like, love is good. We Jews like love, we are God loves, but you can't have a Jewish theology that doesn't have obligation. And Christians just didn't seem to be that concerned with obligation. I was like, we have mitzvah, like we need to be obligated. So which metaphor is going to speak to that? And there are a couple, but it was water, I realized, that speaks to that. So this is not entirely, so this is a partial answer. So I'm going to read, I'm gonna read this. I think, Mom, you're out there? My mom's on. A little story that involves my mother. When she says she doesn't remember, but I remember it. When I was a teenager in the dark ages before mobile phones and the internet, it was challenging to stay in touch with faraway friends. The summer after 11th grade, I went to camp and met kids from my youth movement who lived all over the country. Back home, I wanted to stay in touch with them, but long-distance telephone calls were prohibitively expensive. One of my friends had figured out how to charge calls to a third party, and she'd found a list of phone numbers of embassies of particularly odious regimes. Feeling like I was both avoiding a huge expense and striking a blow for justice, I would head out to the local 7-Eleven, which had a payphone outside, and spend hours talking with my far-flung friends, charging the calls to a variety of Latin American dictatorships. One day, my mother found out what I had been doing. My mom is the most honest person I know, and she was incredibly upset by this. In my rather obnoxious teenage way, I didn't understand what was so wrong. It's not like these embassies can't afford it, and besides, they're terrible. But my protestations were to no avail. It was dishonest, it was stealing, and my mother insisted that she'd rather pay for the calls herself than to have me continue. I think I stopped at that point, most immediately because I was afraid of getting caught. But on a deeper level, I was moved by my mother's commitments to her values. She didn't punish me, but she taught me something that I still remember. I wonder about the sense of obligation that each of us feels in different ways. Obligations to other people, to a sense of right and wrong, to deeply held values. Each of us has lines that we won't cross. For my mother, I had clearly crossed the line with my third-party phone calls. I have many such lines in my own life. I became a vegetarian at age 13 because I didn't want to harm animals. I won't cross a picket line of striking workers. I always tell a cashier if they haven't charged me properly. Some people think of these types of obligations as coming from their parents or from some innate sense of right and wrong. For others, ethical do's and don'ts come directly from God. For many people, a central role of religion is to make clear what is right and wrong and to back it up with a divine decree. So I go on to talk about sort of a traditional notion of God as commander, right, and the sorts of right and wrong, and a sort of the God as ruler. But what happens when we no longer believe in a ruler, commander God? Does that mean that our sense of right and wrong is random and relative, differing from person to person, based on our own idiosyncratic upbringings? Is there anything out there that obligates us, and if so, how? So this all comes in the context of God as water. And I talk about how in Deuteronomy, and I really learned this from Rabbi Arthur Waskow, when the texts that talk about, like the second paragraph of the Shema that talks about God withholding rain is often read as punishment and as anger. If you do the wrong thing, I will withhold the rain, and to show you you're doing the wrong thing. But if we don't understand it as punishment, but rather as consequence, if we think of God as the fount of living waters, we can read these verses quite differently. Instead of reward and punishment, we can understand the Torah to be describing a sacred ecology of actions and their consequences. In this ecology, the flow of water is key to understanding our relationship with the source of life. By fulfilling our spiritual and ethical obligations, we align ourselves with the divine flow of goodness and truth. When we do this, the rain falls, the waters of nourishment and blessing pour out as they are meant to. In the metaphor of God as water, we are given a whole new way to think about God's power and how that power affects us. Water's impact is felt in a myriad of ways, in the sweeping destruction of a tidal wave, in the slow wearing away of stones in a river, in the creation of massive canyons through eons of steady pressure. Water's power can be deadly and overwhelming, but it can also be subtle and gentle. And I go on to talk about what the process theologians call persuasive power, which is this kind of water power. If we think about godly power using water metaphors as an ocean, a stream, a driving rain, we can move beyond a concept of power as control over and let go of the notion of God as some kind of puppet master. We will also have to let go of any fantasy of God as a superhero who will show up and save the day when evil threatens us. God as cosmic flow can show us the way and guide our path, but only if and when we are willing to channel that power for the good. So in the water chapter, I go on to talk about justice, and that's one part of the midot. The midah of like compassion, I talk about in the Makom chapter, as I said, sort of in that place, and locating that place here. So yeah, I mean, and there are Musar practices in here. There's values clarification. So in terms of practices, a lot of different Jewish practices. There's prayer practices in here. There's some mindfulness, more Buddhist practices. There's meditation practices, like candle meditation that's Jewish. There's a Jewish practice, and there's definitely some Musar. I worked on this. Rabbi David Jaffe, you probably know from his book, Changing the World from the Inside Out, was one of my co-conspirators in this book, and I asked him for some of his practices. So yeah, I think, I'll just close by saying, I think a lot of I'll just leave you with this. When a question comes up around God, and I would say, and for ourselves, we can bemoan those around us and what they do or don't believe, but trust them to be on their own path. But for ourselves, when a question comes up, I think the question that I invite you to ask is this a question about God, or is it a question about a metaphor? I.e., is it a question about God as a big person, and once we shift out, and once we realize how much we're in that metaphor, of course we're in it. We live in a Christian society in which God is literally a person. Like, it's very hard to get out of that metaphor, but once we can see it, we can understand that a lot of the questions that were thought of as classical theological questions, why do bad things happen to good people? You were referencing that in your introduction to this talk, right? But that question makes no sense if God is water. Like, you don't say to the ocean, why are you doing this to me? Like, what do you mean? Just it's the ocean, like it flows. That's what it does, questions about existence and non-existence. A lot of these classic theological questions to me were just like relatively uninteresting debates about a metaphor. And to me, this is much more interesting to like go back and be like, were our ancestors actually experiencing the divine and trying to get a little close to it again? And I think we can. I don't think we can't go back. We can't be in that space, but we can begin to recapture some of it. So read the book. Happy to answer your questions. And when it's not Shabbos, I'll sign your book if you want. Thanks everyone on Zoom.
Toba, it's always a delight for me to learn from you, and having read the book, to be able to hear you drash about it is it's something we don't get from the rabbis, right? They wrote a lot of stuff. We don't get to hear them drash about what they wrote. So this is a great privilege. I want to take a moment to close, and also to put out an appeal if Paula is there, or Hannah, and Mason, you'll just signal me if Paula unmutes, yeah? If she wants to say something.
Actually, I wrote something along the way because I finished reading the book. It was very, very interesting, and I really liked it, and I'll keep it going.
It's like she has so many underlines in there. It's quite something. This is a terrific talk, and I think that if Alan were here, he would really, really be having a great time, because not only is it so intellectually engaging, but it's just so funny as well. So we're just very grateful.
Excellent.
I think that's the best closing we could possibly have. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, everyone on Zoom. Thank you, Joshi Tzedek, for helping make this book happen. And thank you for all of you for being open to something that's dramatic. I just want to say this is dramatic. It may feel new to you, but it's not different. It is not different from Judaism. It's not different from Torah. It's not different from our prayers. It actually can help us all enhance our experience of whatever it is we call Judaism, religion, or the divine. So thank you, Toba.
Thank you so much.
So we have a book, we have books in the back, which I'll be happy to hand out, and I'm gonna hand them out so that if someone isn't fortunate to get one, I will remember your name and make sure we get you one. So there'll be one per household. Is there a number household?